This is a production of Cornell University.
I'm Michelle Moody Adams, Vice Provost for Undergraduate Education at Cornell, and also Hutchison Professor of Ethics and Public Life and Professor of Philosophy. I'm delighted to welcome you to today's panel discussion of Senator Barack Obama's March 18, 2008 speech on race, religion, and politics. The speech has already been deemed by many to be the best political speech since John F. Kennedy's remarks about religion and politics during the 1960 presidential campaign. Some have even described Obama's effort as one of the best political speeches in American history. 5 distinguished members of the Cornell community will be commenting today on the nature and significance of the speech. First, Professor Nick Salvatore, the Maurice and Hinda Newfield Founders Professor of Industrial and Labor Relations and Professor of American Studies. Second, Professor James Turner, who is Professor and founder of the Africana Studies Research Center. Then interim Muslim chaplain Omer Bajwa. Fourth, Professor Margaret Washington of the History Department. And then finally, Reverend Kenneth Clarke, Director of Cornell United Religious Work. Now here is our plan for today's event. We're going to begin with a brief video excerpt from Senator Obama's speech, and then each of the 5 panelists will speak for approximately 5 minutes, and I'll do my best to keep them to that figure. After those remarks, we will open up the floor for about a 25-minute question and answer period. So please hold your questions until after all the 5 panelists have spoken. And then before the session ends, our plan is to allow each of the panelists about 3 minutes for a few closing remarks. And I want to make 2 very brief observations before our video begins. First of all, there are refreshments available, and we'd like you to please feel free to partake of them at any time. And secondly, a very quick note for any students from the Law and Society program. The sign-in sheet for this event will be in the back of the room. And so, let us begin then by contemplating a brief video excerpt from Senator Obama's speech. Thank you.
In the end, then, what is called for is nothing more and nothing less than what all the world's great religions demand, that we do unto others as we would have them do unto us. Let us be our brother's keeper, Scripture tells us. Let us be our sister's keeper. Let us find that common stake we all have in one another, and let our politics reflect that spirit as well. For we have a choice in this country. We can accept a politics that breeds division and conflict and cynicism. We can tackle race only as spectacle, as we did in the O.J. trial, or in the wake of tragedy, as we did in the aftermath of Katrina, or as fodder for the nightly news. We can play Reverend Wright's sermons on every channel, every day, and talk about them from now until the election, and make the only question in this campaign whether or not the American people think that I somehow believe or sympathize with his most offensive words. We can pounce on some gaffe by a Hillary supporter as evidence that she's playing the race card. Or we can speculate on whether white men will all flock to John McCain in the general election, regardless of his policies. We can do that. But if we do, I can tell you that in the next election, we'll be talking about some other distraction. And then another one. And then another one. And nothing will change. That is one option. Or, at this moment, in this election, we can come together and say, not this time. This time we want to talk about the crumbling schools that are stealing the future of black children and white children and Asian children and Hispanic children and Native American children. This time we want to reject the cynicism that tells us that these kids can't learn, that those kids who don't look like us are somebody else's problem. The children of America are not those kids, they are our kids, and we will not let them fall behind in the 21st century economy. Not this time. This time we want to talk about how the lines in the emergency room are filled with whites and blacks and Hispanics who do not have health care, who don't have the power on their own to overcome the special interests in Washington, but who can take them on if we do it together. This time, we want to talk about the shuttered mills that once provided a decent life for men and women of every race, and the homes for sale that once belonged to Americans from every religion, every region, every walk of life. This time, we want to talk about the fact that the real problem is not that someone who doesn't look like you might take your job, it's that the corporation you work for will ship it overseas for nothing more than a profit. This time, we want to talk about the men and women of every color and creed who serve together and fight together and bleed together under the same proud flag. We want to talk about how to bring them home from a war that should have never been authorized and should have never been waged. And we want to talk about how we'll show our patriotism by caring for them and their families and giving them the benefits that they have earned.
I think that Senator Obama's speech was one of the most powerful and honest speeches on the issue of race in American life ever given by a president or a major presidential candidate in all of our history. I think you can go back for an example or for a comparison to Robert F. Kennedy's speech in April of 1968 before an African-American audience in Indianapolis, where he shared with them the horrific news that Martin Luther King had died in an assassination. You can also perhaps go back to Abraham Lincoln, specifically to his second inaugural address in 1865, with its somber, serious warning that the Civil War could indeed continue as God's punishment for America's original sin, quote, until all the wealth piled up by the bondsman's 200 years of unrequited toil shall be sunk. It is a powerful, powerful speech, but it's not just powerful for its rhetoric, as important as that is. It's powerful for at least two other major reasons as well, I think. One, it's powerful because Obama directly and bluntly addressed the responsibilities and the choices before all Americans. To the white community, he said, it's critical that you recognize, and again I quote, that what ails the black community does not just exist in the minds of black people. Quoting William Faulkner, the Mississippi author, he pointed out that the past, quoting Faulkner, the past isn't dead and buried, it isn't even past. And we use that as a way to talk about the continued impact of discriminatory practices across the last 40 years. But then he also turned and addressed the African American community and insisted the need to, as he put it, to embrace the burdens of our past without becoming victims of our present, victims of our past. And he noted a series of issues that he discussed briefly under that rubric, and that they needed to be addressed and engaged, he said, in a manner that he termed the quintessentially American and, yes, conservative notion of self-help. But he went further than that. He went on. And he stated that along with recognizing the legitimacy of black anger, it was also critical for all Americans to recognize the legitimacy of white resentment. Most working and middle class white Americans, Obama stated, don't feel that they've been particularly privileged by their race. And he might have added, in terms of, as he will go on to point out, in terms of the economics and privileged status and place within the society. This then led, I think, to a third point, in which Obama provided, and I think this is one of the most powerful parts of his speech, he provided his audience and all of us with a bridge to a vision of a common good that might span the racial divides that have been such an important part of our collective history. And I think there were two key components here. One was, and we just heard it again, we have and possess the will to choose. Not this time, he said. This time we're going to do something different. And that in itself was a profound call to engagement, each of us in our daily lives, not just in on a national level. And secondly, he addressed serious questions of substance. The economic and social benefits that are needed and that we find ourselves vying for against each other are not, if we recast and reimagine, are not a zero-sum game. Rather, both blacks and whites and others who share resentments that are often expressed at each other, in the process of doing that, distract attention, as he put it, from the real culprits of the middle-class squeeze. And he went on to talk, as we just saw in the clip, about a corporate culture with its short-term emphasis on greed, about the transfer of jobs overseas without any concern for or attention to the costs to people at home, about the need for health care, schools, housing, and the like. I think this is the core challenge that Obama offered Americans. We can continue to treat race as a spectacle, as a tragedy, or as he put it, fodder for the nightly news. Or we can, to borrow from another famous American address, John Winthrop's model of Christian charity, quote, we can choose life that we and our seed may live. And in doing that, we can build a bridge to achieving the goals shared by many Americans on all sides of that racial divide. Politically, the question is clear. Will it work? But as an analysis of the reality of race in American life and of a potential restating of goals within that political context, it is a most powerful and potent speech.
Well, thank you. Always the challenge on panels of this sort is that you're going to come behind a colleague who has gone through in detail the speech And all of us, in some ways, are supposed to have had part of that speech. So Nick should have taken his part and then left us our part, and I'd leave Margaret and Ken some. But at least what it does, it relieves one of the responsibility in part to have to go over that the speech in that way. What I'd like to do is begin by talking a little bit about this political season. It strikes me that this has been an exceptional political season up to the Obama speech. From the beginning of the primary campaigns for the nomination of presidential candidates for the Democratic and Republican Party, there has been unusual political interest, public interest. Most often in previous primary caucuses and elections, they have been left to relatively few Americans, something like less than 10% or so of the electorate. It has very rarely captured the imagination of the public in the way in which we've seen in this season. Some would say mostly primaries were relatively staid and unimaginative events. The process fairly predictable and not much surprise in the outcome. Generally speaking, a pattern is usually set after the first 4 or 6 early primaries. This political season, however, has been chock full of surprises. First, the level of interest, as I've indicated, indeed beyond interest, enthusiasm, and grassroots participation has been unprecedented. The professional analysts and scholars have largely agreed that the primary elections of 2008 are incomparable, not easily compared to similar experiences in previous American history. In fact, the current politics might very well constitute, as my colleague has suggested, a new chapter in the making of U.S. politics. Last summer, as you all will recall, most pundits expected a rather customary primary season. Hillary Clinton was thought to have a commanding lead that was virtually insurmountable. John McCain was hardly considered a serious contender on the Republican side. And what a flip that's been. But it was the novice, the newcomer to national politics, who was to excite the imagination of the electorate. The junior senator from Illinois, still in his first term in the Senate, stimulated the political process and attracted huge crowds to his banner for change in the country. He was celebrated as a political star on the horizon. He won a string of almost 11 victories in states that are virtually all white in the so-called heartland of America. He split New England with Hillary and swept the South. With each election, it seemed his support increased exponentially. The political momentum was clearly shifting to Barack Obama. Then, almost without warning, his victory train was sideswiped. When reporters released to the media tapes from a speech by Barack Obama's senior pastor almost 7 years ago, a major controversy quickly developed over the pastor's comments that threatened to derail his journey to Disneyland and the glorious political kingdom of the Wizard of Oz. After several days of frenetic television coverage and 10-second bites of the outspoken pastor, a feeding frenzy threatened to get out of control and consume Obama's campaign of audacious hope and new inspiration for the nation. Announcement was released from his campaign officials that on Tuesday, March 18th, Mr. Obama would make a major statement in Philadelphia. Many began to wonder what that might be. In fact, conventional wisdom expected that he would condemn, repudiate, and disregard his pastor personally and not just his comments. Furthermore, that he would dissect the pastor, throw his flesh to the lions to satisfy the roar of the Colosseum. That would have been the predictable action to take, and clearly there are those in the media who especially expected that he would do just that. After all, this is all about pragmatism and politics, and high-stakes politics at that. But instead, to the surprise of many, as we now know, he took a different turn. He decided to seize the moment to address the vexing matter of race in American life and culture, often avoided and denied. Race and racism in American history and culture has been seldom the subject for political campaigns, let alone for a front runner for the presidency. It was risky as it was daring. This was completely without precedent, especially for a politician. And tension and anxiety, the tension and anxiety that obstruct matters of race and racism are traceable in part to the reluctance to conduct a truthful discourse about race. This was not politics as usual. In fact, as one observed, it was a personal and a searing look at the problem of race and a call for the entire country to face the legacy stained by this original sin. Okay. The fact that Mr. Obama would step forward and take the challenge on is a measure of his personal courage and personal character. It was certainly a remarkable speech, the core of which was the reference to Faulkner about the past not really yet have in the past. Obama said in an interview on Nightline shortly after the speech that he expected that he would have to make this speech at some point, given who he is and what the country is. The question, of course, was when. The speech, whether the speech will help him or not, is uncertain at this point. He has moved his campaign into uncharted waters. Whether the voters will be alienated or will welcome a mediation on race is yet to be determined. The elections in Indiana and Pennsylvania will, of course, be determinative. Certainly they will be serious bellwethers. It was, without question, a historic speech. It was not a perfect speech, but nonetheless it was a serious one. Most were impressed by the level of seriousness to which Obama addressed the issue of race. In the final analysis, history will record the speech as a speech that either saved the candidacy or hastened the demise of the campaign of the first African-American bid for the presidency of the United States. Hopefully it will be the former. Thank you.
Our next speaker is interim Muslim chaplain Omer Bajwa.
Good afternoon. It's a privilege to be invited to speak on this distinguished panel. I've been asked to offer a Muslim perspective on Senator Obama's comments regarding, quote, radical Islam and the implications of such language. In the interest of time, I will present three main points, although I believe there is much more to be said about race, Islam, and America. I must also acknowledge the works of two writers, Firas Ahmed and Shadi Hamid, that have informed my own comments. The first point is that Obama's speech actually only mentioned Islam once, albeit in quite a problematic context. Early on, while refuting Reverend Jeremiah Wright's distorted view of America, Obama said that Reverend Wright expressed, quote, a view that sees the conflicts in the Middle East as rooted primarily in the actions of stalwart allies like Israel instead of emanating from the perverse and hateful ideologies of radical Islam, end quote. The problem here is that juxtaposing Israel with radical Islam sets up a false dichotomy. Radical Islam is too broad of a category, yet Obama is saying that this devious apparition is the problem and that it exists independent of any material factors in the world. This is a sloppy and facile explanation that appears to reify a nebulous and contested concept. It would have been more responsible for him to use more specific language here. So for example, he could have said, violent extremists or Al-Qaeda in place of radical Islam in this quote. While this doesn't solve the imbalance of the simplistic dichotomy, at least it's more precise by talking about groups or categories as opposed to concepts. In short, his language exploits dubious stereotypes that sadly resonate with segments of our misinformed population given today's geopolitical situation. So it tells us nothing about complex realities of the world around us. Instead, Senator Obama refuses to challenge the establishment's status quo of our foreign policy scenario. Ironically, Obama seems to be making the same mistake that he criticized Reverend Jeremiah Wright for, in which he said later, the problem is that he's simplifying and stereotyping and amplifying the negative to the point that it's distorting reality. My second point is that Senator Obama's language in this speech potentially exacerbates certain existing anti-Muslim sentiments. There has been significant media coverage about the senator's religion and specifically about his perceived closeness to Islam. Speculation about his perceived, quote, closeness to Islam have had certain political ramifications. The various allegations that have been circulating on the internet, on talk radio, on news programs, etc., are basically very simple fear-mongering tactics because they are once again tapping into certain people's anxieties about Islam and Muslims in today's world. Attacking Obama for his pseudo-association with Islam is a far safer and more acceptable strategy for right-wing zealots than attacking him for being black. Sadly, almost anything having to do with Islam or Muslims is seen as radioactive in today's society. Ironically, many Muslims are in fact quite excited about Senator Obama's candidacy. But for many reasons, Muslims are one constituency Senator Obama does not want to court. At a time when endorsements are worn like badges of honor, no major candidate is looking for the Muslim vote. Obama's lack of public defense of Islam is not so much an indictment against him as it is the demonstration of the infantile state of Muslim political participation in the United States. That's a separate discussion. But for now, I want to ask the question that many Muslims are asking themselves: how do you support a candidate that doesn't want your support? Obviously, there are clear political realities in this election cycle, and we shouldn't be naive enough to expect any serious public support or defense of Muslims from him or his campaign. Nonetheless, based on my conversations with other Muslims, especially young, bright, educated, professional Muslims, I have sensed a hopeful message. By Obama not being the typical white establishment candidate, it gives some Muslims, both here and abroad, hope for what America can be. This brings me to my final point. One of the poignant and reoccurring themes of Senator Obama's speech was about honestly confronting our race problems as we, quote, continue on the path to a more perfect union. He went on to say at the end of his speech, this union may never be perfect, but generation after generation has shown that it can always be perfected. And today, whenever I find myself feeling doubtful or cynical about this possibility, what gives me the most hope is the next generation, the young people whose attitudes and beliefs and openness to change have already made history in this election, end quote. From my perspective, I would argue that one of the most critical problems that needs to be addressed today is the problem of an increasingly pervasive Islamophobia in our political and social discourse. Again, this is part of a much larger discussion, and I've only offered a very brief analysis here. Senator Obama's words and actions are indicative of the existence and acceptability of Islamophobia in America today. As scholars are now showing, this Islamophobia is not a new phenomenon per se. It has been constructed in various racist and xenophobic mythologies. Today's geopolitical problems have just exacerbated certain situations. We need to be aware that uncritical analyses of these issues merely clouds the underlying problems. I acknowledge that this problem cannot be solved overnight, just as our race problem cannot be solved overnight. Nevertheless, I am inspired by Senator Obama's message that we need to keep working towards a more perfect union. As Americans, this is especially relevant given our current involvements in the Muslim world. The fact that we Americans have such an abysmal image abroad, particularly in the Muslim world, should motivate us to repair some of our deepest and most critical wounds. This can begin by intelligently and honestly addressing our existing realities and mythologies. I would like to believe that we are capable in our own ways of working towards a more perfect union. Thank you very much.
Our next commentator is Professor Margaret Washington.
Thank you. On the day that Barack Obama was to give his speech, I rushed home from the Island Help Club, thinking to myself all along as I drove, I hope to God he doesn't grovel. And that was what I was thinking of, in view of everything that he had gone through in regard to his relationship with Reverend Jeremiah Wright, in regard to allusions to his relationship to Louis Farrakhan, and the manner in which he spoke about that relationship at the interview or the debate he had with Hillary Clinton. I was worried, and I need not have been, because I feel very fortunate, as I'm sure many of you do, to have actually heard that kind of a speech from a front runner for the presidency of the United States. And as a historian, I was especially impressed by the way he began. And that was not on the segment, so let me just read it very briefly. The document that they produced, that is the Founding Fathers, was eventually signed, that is the Constitution, but ultimately unfinished. It was stained by this nation's original sin of slavery, a question that divided the colonies and brought the convention to a stalemate until the founders chose to allow the slave trade to continue for at least 20 years and to leave any final resolution to future generations. Of course, the answer to the slavery question was already embedded in our Constitution, a Constitution that had at its very core the ideal of equal citizenship under the law, a Constitution that promises to people liberty and justice, and a union that could be and should be perfected over time. Now, there are some key issues in that statement. The Constitution was an ideal. It was not a reality. It was not a reality for people of African descent. It was not a reality for women. And this was something that had to be won. It had to be challenged. It had to be fought for. And one of the most significant aspects of Obama's speech to me was the way in which he began with the Constitution and let that be a trajectory to the path that led to the kind of comments that someone like Reverend Jeremiah Wright would make on occasion, not as a policy, not as a pattern. And yet, one of the front runners for the presidency of the United States found himself in a position in which he had to defend those remarks, which gives us some sense of how far we've come and how far we have to go. And I wanted to say a few things about the Constitution and the fact that it is, or it was, an ideal. It was not a reality. And the reason that we have Barack Obama as a candidate is because we have gotten closer to the ideal, but we are still not there yet. And I think that the fact that he had to answer those kinds of questions is a testament to the fact that we have not gotten there. But people have struggled over that, and we have to look at the Constitution as something that we have to strive for to make a reality. People have striven for that for many, many years. William Lloyd Garrison called the Constitution a covenant with death and an agreement with hell. The Constitution in 1857, according to Roger Taney, the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, required that African Americans be second-class citizens, or indeed were not citizens. According to Taney, the white man had no right to respect the black man. These, he said, was part of the Constitution. Thurgood Marshall said that the Constitution was a pro-slavery document until the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments were ratified. So we are dealing not with the reality, but with an ideal that we're still striving for. And Obama's point was that this is a document that had flaws, and what he represented standing in front of the nation was moving closer and closer to that ideal. So I think that whether or not he wins or loses, that he has challenged us to create a dialogue about race and about America's position in the world. I am really happy that he made the speech, but I feel very unhappy that he was put in a position in which he had to defend himself in a way that other individuals who have run for the office have not. I felt unhappy that Reverend Wright was put in the position where he had to defend himself, when in fact what Reverend Wright said, as Obama implied, was not much different from what other people in other generations have said. For example, if you compare some of the speeches that Martin Luther King made with some of the comments that Reverend Wright had made from his pulpit, then you will see a similarity. You could compare the comments of Reverend Wright with many historical figures in American history who have challenged the structure of American society. It is our right, it is our duty to do so, and Reverend Wright did that, and Obama found himself in a position where he had to support him, and as I said, when I came home, I was so thankful he did not grovel. He stood by his pastor. As he said, anyone would stand by their priest or their rabbi without condoning and agreeing with everything he said, but at the same time recognizing that they had a bond, a spiritual bond, and whatever Reverend Wright's political proclivities were, they were not necessarily Obama's, but he was not prepared to denounce him. So, okay, all right. In conclusion, let me say that change is going to come, and Obama said we have a choice. In some ways we do, and in some ways we don't. Change will come. The question is whether it will be for the good or for ill.
Our final speaker is Reverend Kenneth Clarke, Director of Cornell United Religious Work.
I want to make two brief points in relation to the speech by Senator Obama. The first being an opportunity seized. That Senator Obama seized the opportunity to have a frank discussion about race in American society through the articulation of a public theology and philosophy. I will explain shortly. By any standard of measurement, Barack Obama's speech in Philadelphia last week was one of the most powerful, significant, and nuanced orations on race relations given by a politician in American history. My co-panelist Nick Salvatore and I last week likened the Obama speech to Lincoln's second inaugural address in 1865 as one of the most effective examples of a politician as both public theologian and public philosopher, grappling with the practices that characterize public life regarding race, religion, and politics. He displayed remarkable candor in highlighting the peril that lay at the promise of American democracy from its inception, what he called this nation's original sin of slavery. The use of the term sin is an interesting usage. It reflects this Judeo-Christian concept of human shortcoming in relation to God and others. It is not a concept found in other faith traditions. Nonetheless, this particular use of this word was able to provide an understanding of the broader context for an understanding of racism, that racism is indeed a moral issue, and that it is, a cancer of the spirit that eats away at the nation's vital organs. The spiritual dimension of this social disease cannot be discounted and must be addressed not only by social policy, not only by legislation, not only by the improvement of interpersonal relations and the creation of a greater pluralism that enables us to engage each other in ways we typically do not, but it also requires, as he said himself, the guidance of the teachings of the great faith traditions. and the involvement of people of faith in solidarity with other Americans committed to work for democratic values. Senator Obama said the bridging of the American racial divide requires adherence to, and I quote, what all the world's great religions demand, that we do unto others as we would have them do unto us, to be our brothers and sisters' keepers, to recognize the common values and virtues that we share that can guide us toward authentic, pluralistic human community. This acknowledgement of the teachings of the multiple faith traditions implicates the roles these communities can play, and indeed always have, in the pursuit of social justice, whether the 19th century abolitionist movement, the black freedom struggle of the 1950s and 60s, the South African freedom movement, peace and environmental justice movements, the labor struggle, or the current struggle for liberty in Tibet. Further, the senator articulated a hope based on his faith in God and faith in the American people that the current racial stalemate, what the late sociologist of religion C. Eric Lincoln called the continuing American dilemma, could be overcome by collective effort. Toward that end, Senator Obama effectively balanced notions of a shared national community and the diverse experiences of Americans. He linked the African American struggle for health care, better jobs, better schools, and the aspirations of whites to those of the aspirations of whites and immigrants. Yet he also highlighted the sources of black anger and white resentment and the need to understand the historical roots of each. In doing so, Obama did what politicians rarely do, wrote James Carney of Time magazine, acknowledge complexity. My second point, which I'll make briefly, is that the Obama speech also represents in a measure an opportunity loss. There was an incomplete explanation in his comments regarding the Reverend Dr. Jeremiah A. Wright Jr. of the black prophetic religious tradition. In addressing the controversy over the remarks by his retired pastor, Senator Obama indeed placed Dr. Wright and his generation of African Americans in the 20th century context of the black struggle for equality. However, Dr. Wright's remarks, in the broader sermonic context of those remarks, I would encourage you to listen to the entire sermon from September 16, 2001, and the entire sermon from the spring of 2003, as opposed to the 30-second sound bites that have been played endlessly on the news. When you do that, you will be able to get a sense, indeed all of us, of how his comments can and must be understood in the prophetic, or I should say in the framework of the prophetic black religious tradition. This tradition is grounded in the prophetic witness of the Jewish scriptures, in which prophets called individuals and nations, often in blunt language, to accountability on behalf of the oppressed and the most vulnerable. The struggles and gains for freedom from slavery, segregation, and other forms of discrimination, not to speak of labor equality, fair housing, and other social initiatives, cannot be understood apart from this tradition and its contributions. This is a tradition which includes the stinging oratory of Frederick Douglass, a member of the African Methodist Episcopal Zion Church, who on the 4th of July, 1851 in Rochester, New York, delivered a speech juxtaposing the reality of slavery with the celebration of America's founding. This tradition includes what King scholar James Cone called the later Martin Luther King Jr., the king of 1965-68, the one Vincent Harding, who spoke from this lectern just a month ago, has called the inconvenient hero. The later king, like Dr. Wright, was a fierce critic of American social policy, especially regarding Vietnam. The later king said bluntly in a sermon that America has a lot of repenting to do. The later king gave his most famous anti-war oration, A Time to Break Silence, in New York City at Riverside Church on April 4th, 1967, exactly a year to the day of his assassination, But that speech was roundly condemned in editorials and op-ed pieces by leading newspapers across the country, not to speak of others. The condemnation of unjust practices that issue forth from this black religious prophetic tradition are not unpatriotic. In fact, the trajectory of these statements reflects a different style of patriotism to which the larger society is often unaccustomed. It is a willingness to criticize the nation and its practices to help the nation, as Dr. King once said, be true to what it has put on paper in relation to the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. It is a willingness to criticize the nation and its practices to make it better. Martin King put it best in the Riverside speech, citing that his criticism of America's prosecution of the Vietnam War was, I quote, a passionate plea to my beloved nation. Later, King said, no one who has any concern for the integrity and life of America today can ignore the present crisis. So it is that those of us who are yet determined that America will be are led down the path of protest and dissent, working for the health of this land. This is an example of the black prophetic tradition about which our society can indeed learn more.
So at this point, we're going to open up the floor for questions, and I just picked two very brief things. We have a microphone here in the center of the chapel. Not everybody is going to be able, even physically or because of where you are, to get there, but if you could try to make it to the microphone, then we won't have to repeat the question. So we can take questions now. Let me make sure I see. Excellent.
I would agree with the panelists that Barack Obama made a powerful and sort of unprecedented speech, but who heard him? I think it's great that we have this audience, this turnout here, but as I listen, try to get some sense of the pulse of America to conservative talk radio, it seems that very few people heard him. That what they did, they've taken the sound bites and they're commenting on them, but they're not commenting on Obama's speech. Secondly, seems to me, how soon we forget that about 10 years ago, Bill Clinton appointed a commission on race to try to begin this kind of conversation discussion. In fact, he encouraged local conversations, which we held here at Cornell University 10 years ago, and no one mentioned that.
Panelists?
I had forgotten about that, Bob, about what happened here, but I think there's also a larger and unfortunate point, is that the energy that might have been released in the Clinton effort with John Hope Franklin as chair of the commission, it was a perfect chair, it was a fairly good commission, although there were problems, got lost in his own personal problems. And I think, I'll be partisan here, but I think what we've seen in this election cycle is a re-emergence of the Clinton personal problems, and they're using the race card as a way to undermine, and they're playing with the most volatile material in our culture. And they're using it for private gain, or what they hope to be private gain. So I'm not moved by the memory of Clinton. I must admit I'm a little biased by that, okay? But yeah, I just wanted to say that.
I would also like to say that according to John Hope Franklin, the committee didn't do very much, that it was sort of an exercise in futility and a lot of window dressing, but not much substance. So one has to ask whether or not there was any real intent behind forming the committee itself. And in terms of whether or not anybody's listening to Obama, I think a lot of people are. And I think that one of the things people have to do is get away from mainstream media. Because, yeah, that is what they're going to play, are sound bites. If you listen to CNN and Fox, because they want you to keep watching. So maybe one of the things people can do is just look for some alternative news.
I think indeed that is... I think indeed that is happening, certainly in the blogosphere. In particular, the commentary of Roland Martin, CNN commentator, who in fact will be speaking here at Sage Chapel on April 20th at 4 p.m., has been exemplary in providing context, for example, for the sermons of Dr. Wright, and looking at this broader notion of race in the society. And in fact, I think in this era, in this sort of postmodern so-called information age, that's another conversation, but in this age of rapid-fire technology that dwarfs distances, I think that there is a great deal of commentary, some coming from professional journalists like Martin and others from very informed citizens, that are indeed providing a counterpoint to CNN and Fox News. And I think that that is a critical mass out there that I think that has to be taken into consideration in the larger spectrum as we look at the impact of Obama's speech and the extent to which this media firestorm that has been created about the right remarks will, the extent to which it will affect his campaign.
I just wanted to say, Bob, you called to mind for me sort of another experience in politics, and that was the Willie Horton affair. And it strikes me that what's being done in the aftermath of Obama's speech is to use these clips of Jeremiah Wright in a kind of Willie Horton fashion, where you see an animated, energized African-American preacher doing what preachers do every Sunday, preach in African-American style, but presenting it in a lens that suggests to white America a sense of threat, where people have argued that level of speech is insightful and incendiary and hate-filled. What I was struck by, when you looked at the pews, the people were standing up clapping and smiling. It is that African Americans, I think, as Ken suggested, have the capacity to look hard at the critique of American society, move on with their expectation for a greater human possibility, and then go out having been relieved to have made their position on some of these matters and go to work all the next week and come around. I was hoping that there would be some approach to that, Margaret, that Jeremiah Wright, who is a respected theologian who speaks in black churches around this country on Sundays and as guest preacher, was in fact involved in the kind of counter-narrative, oppositional narrative that's very common in African-American churches as it is among intellectuals.
Good afternoon. Oh, goodness. Firstly, I just want to thank all of the panelists for what I think is a history-making panel here at Cornell. And one of the things I wanted to ask about is how you see Barack Obama's role as the son of a white American academic and a Kenyan academic, and how his articulation of race relations and a need for reconciliation in this country also could potentially open up a dialogue among black Americans of various heritages, African, Caribbean, African American of various generations, and also filter into things like the Imam was saying about a need for a wider sense of racial reconciliation and respect for faith traditions. I know that there's a limit to the role that someone who's campaigning for candidacy in the world in which we live can play, but he clearly stepped into a role that's changing a whole larger dynamic of how race is being phrased. Thank you.
One thought I have about that is that in a very real way, Obama personifies the racial, if you will, complexity of America in his own person. And some of you may be aware of Henry Louis Gates had recently, I think it was on PBS, a program where a number of prominent African Americans submitted to DNA testing. And the results stunned many of them, and they were reported on camera, or they were interviewed on camera. The point is not that race is going to disappear. That's not where I'm taking this. But the very fact of Obama's complex heritage in terms of what we call race, in terms of having a Muslim father, is I think a tremendously powerful symbol. What, if he's elected, he will do with it, I can't say, but it's an incredibly powerful symbol both within our nation, or to our nation, as well as beyond.
I think we have another question. Did anybody, other panelists want to comment? Or?
I just want to say that I think one of the points that Obama's trying to emphasize is that he's an American. And whether he is the product of a white mother and a black father, and a black father was born in Africa, and a white mother from Kansas, and raised in Honolulu, and a grandmother who had some racist leanings, whatever it is that made him, his first loyalty is as an American. And at the same time, as he said in his speech, he's a member of the black community. And I think that was one of the things that he made clear, and his candidacy makes clear, that he is first and foremost an American, but at the same time, he sees himself as a member of the black community. Even though some blacks think he's not black enough, as he also said in his speech, but that's the complexity, as Professor Salvatore said, of American society.
I think, too, his personal story is a very powerful and compelling symbol and signal for persons of mixed racial ancestry who have often had a set of unique and distinctive struggles, socially and otherwise. And I think that in the way in which he has owned his black and his white heritages, I think sends a tremendous signal to persons who have multiple ancestries that are, in their direct bloodline, as well as those that may be further down the line, to begin to really reckon honestly with the reality of the mixtures in our heritage throughout that cut across all the ethnic lines.
Okay, I think we have another question. I think the young man in blue. Oh.
Thank you very much. This is a great opportunity, and I hope we will continue the discussion. My question is, given the importance and the power of the America in the world today, someone was saying, maybe rhetorically, maybe joking, that all the citizens of the world should be allowed to vote for the American president because of the power, the sheer power that America plays in shaping or trying to shape the world. So my question is, how do we, in our discussion, try to see that aspect of the global community? When we talk about the black anger, that anger is also global. It's not domestic black anger. The term of the anger and the community that expresses that anger stretches across the globe for different reasons, historically. So I would like the panelists to address this issue of the necessary convergence, of the need to create a new world, a new vision, a world of peace that is possible, and how it comes in Obama's speech and how you see it.
Well, I don't have any illusions about Barack Obama having all the answers to problems in America or problems in the world. Who knows, if he were the president, I might be protesting in Washington against him. But I do think that, at least in terms of his past actions and in terms of what he promises, that he offers some hope. And I think, given our disrespect in the world today, that we have to go with that.
Other comments? And in the interest of allowing our panelists a few moments at the end to sum up, I think we'll make this the last question unless there are any others. I haven't seen any other people. Well, you know what? We'll take two more. Okay. So.
My question is, was Obama's speech too late or was it just in time? For a lot of people, it seems as if his post-racial rhetoric sort of set him up for a lot of this, and that if he addressed some of these issues before, it would have sort of shielded him from a lot of the criticism he got from the media. So was it on time or was it too late?
That's a good question. I am not, having said there's a good question, I'm not sure how to answer it. but I'll take a stab at it. I don't know whether it's too late. I do agree with you that perhaps Senator Obama could have preempted some of this because this has really been something that's been lurking around in the shadows for the better part of a year, really from the inception of his candidacy. It just recently hit center stage in these recent months, excuse me, with the soundbite approach to the sermons that he delivered. But, you know, hindsight is always 20/20. I think it was important that he gave it when he gave it. I think had he waited past, say, for instance, March 18th, it may have been too late. And I think that in doing that, he sought, and I think to some degree was effective in being able to shape this situation without it shaping him, despite the fact that it still is swirling around in media circles. So that would be, I guess, in my sense, an attempt to respond to your question.
Could I just add one thing? That I think that he was caught between a rock and a hard place. If he had come out last July, a year ago, talking about layers of complexity within the black community, he would have been essentially dismissed immediately. And I think that, I don't know, I have no inside information, but I think that that was probably a strategic decision that the campaign made. Not that they were, and so part of the result was that they ended up getting attacked for trying to be post-racial, and race doesn't matter. I don't think my own personal feelings, I don't think he ever felt that. But I think that he almost had to wait for events to occur, or else it would have been perceived by many in the white community. And again, I think Professor Washington's right. He's really trying to say, I am an American and I am an African American. But he would have been perceived by many in the white community as, oh yeah, right, Jesse Jackson. You know, that kind of an approach, as His Eminence Bill Clinton did. And I think that that's where he was in a rock and a hard place.
I would also just add that we all should be mindful that this didn't just come out of thin air. That is, this moment with the Reverend Wright was in the making for some time. And his candidacy, his campaign understood it was just a matter of time when the shoe would be dropped. Some of you will remember last spring, or was it when he announced his candidacy that he was going to run, he took a decision then, quietly, to disinvite his pastor after he had asked him to come to Springfield at the foot of the Lincoln home to give the invocation. But the right wing had tipped its hand. Tucker Carlson had already then gone on television and indicated that he was involved in this cult amongst this racial group, and that they were planning to use it. So it was circumstance, as well as this notion, Ernie, of timing, because he also reports that his advisors were split as to whether he should make that speech. And that's interesting in itself. But his wife, among most of his African-American advisors, encouraged him to step forward and address the issue.
Very good. So can we take our final question, and after that we'll give the panelists a few moments to make some concluding observations. So our last questioner.
Hi, my name is Antoinette King. I'd like to thank you all for coming here and putting this on. And I'd like to thank my professor for interrupting class and allowing us all to come here today. So my question has a lot to do with what you were saying earlier. Given that Obama does, I think the quote was, he personifies racial complexity in his own person. And given the pressure to sort of deny oneself in order to appeal to the masses in America, how do you think things will play out if he does indeed become the Democratic candidate and he is forced to, do you think he will defend his identity, or do you think he will play into the masses? And also, what does the fact that he still seems to have widespread appeal after his speech, what do you think that fact says about the state of America today and the state of young people?
Great, thank you. Any takers?
Yeah, I'm just trying to formulate. I think, honestly, that what we saw on March 18th in that speech was the reason why Barack Obama, there will not be any difficulty for Barack Obama in denying any part of himself. And I say it for the following reason. What Obama did in writing that speech, and he wrote it himself, what is reflected in that speech is some 30 years of experience, of pain, of joy, of thought, of reading and consideration. Whether one agrees or disagrees with all of the speeches is, as you would say, another conversation. But what is really important and one of the things I came away from the speech with was this sense of, if he becomes president, this may be the first time in memory that we have somebody as a president who has an inner core that he trusts and is able astoundingly to communicate it to the rest of our community, our broad community. That, there's no guarantee. I mean, power does do funny things to people. There's no question about that. So I don't want to be Pollyanna here. But that was my basic, I mean, beneath the specifics, that was my core reaction to him. It wasn't the first time I felt it, but it was the most powerful way of time I felt it. And I think that that would be, answer no, but a partial sense of how it could go.
I would agree with Nick on that. I think as history reveals, and one of the dynamics of a democracy has to do with the fact citizens hold governments accountable. And so I think that, were Senator Obama elected, I think about the comment Cornell West made in Rolling Stone magazine a few weeks ago. He said he would dance in the streets in the morning and party in the afternoon, and the next day he would be his fiercest critic.
Right.
And that he would be, seeking to hold him accountable as president of the nation to live up to the promises on which he campaigned. As invariably, and I think Nick has alluded to that, I mean, study of politics reveals that oftentimes, and I'm not trying to say this out of cynicism in relation to Senator Obama, candidates campaign in one way and often govern in another way in many cases, or there's sometimes overlap between campaign promises and the implementation of policy. But oftentimes, there are two different phenomena, and so I think it's an accountability matter that is in the hands of we the people who are committed to these issues to indeed hold potentially President Obama accountable. But I think that there's an opening there in terms of a person who understands the dynamic, complex realities of American life, based on his own story, his own experience as an African American with a black father, a white mother. There's potential there and an opportunity to appeal to him in a way that perhaps may not be operative in other candidates.
Thank you very much. I think the questions and the answers have been quite wonderful. At this point, I'd like to give our panelists a chance to make a very short set of concluding remarks. I apologize for the time, meaning that they may have to be sort of soundbite-ish. So why don't shall we begin with Professor Turner? Just a few concluding remarks?
Thank you. I want to start at a point in which I mentioned in my comments that what's really, I think, astounding about this moment is that a presidential candidate, not a professor, not a clergyman, but a politician running for the highest position in the country, made a decision that he would not simply go in the calculated, pragmatic way, that he decided at that moment to make his stand, and he did so. He did it in a way that was not only eloquent and imaginative, it was also daring and challenging, because he raises the question of slavery, which is the biggest boogeyman in American culture. And he raises it not as original sin, but in a historical and sociological way, he suggests it as the major contradiction to American society. And he talks about it not only in these idealist and spiritual terms, but also in practical sociological terms. He makes the reference to Faulkner by way of suggesting that the problems of disparities and inequalities that we experience today are historically rooted. They come from a pattern of historical development. And then he goes on to say something else, which is, I think, been often overlooked. He said, I have no, I have no imagination that one electoral cycle will solve this entire problem, but that we indeed must address it. Now, whether or not we are prepared to do that, I think is the question in the aftermath of the speech. What I would like to see is that we all read the speech, read it in its entirety, that perhaps a project that for students and faculty would to have them read it and then have commentary from it. There is also questions to be raised. He argued that he differed with the position that racism is endemic. That seems to me an area for open discussion. And also he said, we can retreat, he said, to our respective corners and continue a racial stalemate. And I wonder if that's not the way we're being led by the dominant opinion makers. He said we can continue to loop these sound bites on evening news and cause us to, in fact, retreat. And I've said to say what seems to be happening is just what he worried
Professor Turner?
about. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Salvatore?
Real quick, I just want to address that question that Professor Harris raised, as well as Professor Turner now, about where we're being led, who hears. Go on YouTube. This is a generational issue, and I'm crossing the line here, because the three of us are of the same generation. But go on YouTube. It is the most hit-on, what do you call it? Thing, video. Approaching over 1 million people listening to Obama's speech, number one. So I think this has been the secret of Obama's campaign all along. This is what the Clinton campaign never saw, number one. Number two, Obama said in a debate when he was asked by, I think, Tim Russert, but it may have been somebody else, What do you think, who do you think Martin Luther King would endorse? And I had no prep for this. He had no time to kind of consult with anybody. He said from his heart, nobody. He would be organizing the people. And that's that's what Reverend Clarke just said. But here was Obama in the heat of the debate, speaking from within, and speaking, frankly, I thought at the time, as the former Chicago organizer. Okay.
Thank you.
Finally,
No.
One last thing. I suggest you go on Google and do Edward Peck and quotes American ambassador, Iraq, whatever. Get to Edward Peck. Edward Peck gave an interview right soon after 9/11. Jeremiah Wright used much of he incorporated into his own thinking, and it's not a denial of the prophetic tradition, but it was Edward Peck, the former Carter's ambassador to Iraq, who delivered a blistering attack close in the immediate aftermath of 9/11 on American policy and whether I don't remember whether Peck used you referred to Malcolm's phrase of chickens coming home to roost back in '63, but there's no question but that was Edward Peck's analysis. There are consequences for the actions we take. So not only is Jeremiah Wright within an African-American prophetic tradition that is both religious and secular, i.e. Frederick Douglass, but he also, is Jeremiah Wright, but he also is echoing something that that there are elements within the white community historically. This is lost completely in our discussion.
Thank you.
Thank you. I just want to say that I was asked to comment on one particular sentence. If you delete that sentence, I really felt it was an outstanding speech at so many different levels. It offers a very supple mind that he was working with. But I will come back to that particular sentence. And actually picking up where Professors Turner and Salvatore were talking about is talking about contextualizing radicalism and looking at various disparities, economic disparities, racial inequalities. My prepared remarks are, while Barack Obama's speech on race was geared primarily towards domestic concerns, as an American Muslim of South Asian descent, I was struck by the possibilities this speech offered not only for race relations at home, but for our relationship with Muslims abroad. Obama declared that the anger is real, it is powerful, and to simply wish it away, to condemn it without understanding its roots, only serves to widen the chasm of misunderstanding. He was speaking, of course, about the legacy of slavery and segregation. But he might as well have been talking about the burgeoning anger towards America felt by millions of frustrated Muslims around the world. And the conversation Senator Obama tried to initiate, contextualizing radicalism and seeking its source rather than merely denouncing it, is a sort of conversation that could also lay the groundwork for a long overdue reassessment of our approach to the Middle East and to the Muslim world. As Americans, we can, at this moment, hopefully, with Obama, begin to try to articulate a new strategy, one which, without condoning violence, acknowledges Arab and Muslim grievances and their very real sense of being wronged by history. We can seek to better understand why the Middle East and the Muslim world has become a graveyard of shattered hopes and an open wound that threatens world security. And we can work to address the unacceptable fact that while much of the rest of the world moves forward, many Arab and many Muslim populations live in economic misery under brutal autocratic regimes, many of which our government supports with foreign aid. As Obama said in his speech, anger is not always productive. Indeed, all too often it distracts attention away from solving real problems. It keeps us from squarely facing our own complicity in our condition. Senator Obama is right that in order to address that anger and radicalism, we must understand the context in which grievances came to be and to target the conditions that continue to nurture those grievances. As I mentioned before, this can be our contribution to strengthening our union. Thank you.
Thank you.
I think Senator Obama's speech opened the door for us as a society to engage the complex reality of race relations in America. It was open not only to politicos, pundits, and social analysts, but to persons of faith communities, indeed to the broad society. While much of his conversation or speech focused on the black-white dynamic of race relations, it clearly has implications for the multi-hued color line. If W.E.B. Du Bois said the problem of the 20th century was the problem of the color line, the problem of the 21st century is a multi-hued color line. He invited us, America, and all of its diversity, to a broader national conversation and issued a challenge to us about whether or not to choose a politics that breeds division, conflict, and cynicism, or one that transcends that brand of politics to grapple with and work to resolve the vexing social, cultural, political, and economic issues of our times. The senator, by putting that choice before us, asked something of us. It is akin to John Kennedy's most famous words from his 1961 inaugural. Ask not what your country can do for you. Ask what you can do for your country. Is it akin to Lincoln's appeal in 1865, the appeal to the better angels of our nature? It is akin to Martin King's plea in 1967 for the sake of the nation to cease the warring madness of Vietnam. Each of these figures, Kennedy, Lincoln, King, Obama, have asked something of the nation at a critical juncture in the nation's life. To look beyond self, to expand horizons, to serve, to be engaged, to grapple with complexity. And I think it's important for us to recognize that in this grappling with these issues and summoning this call, as Senator Obama has put it to us, it will not come without struggle. As Frederick Douglass said, those who want progress without struggle are those who want crops without rain. But the byproduct of that struggle can be a hard-won hope. Hope is born of struggle. And it is on the notion of hope that Senator Obama has based his campaign and run a campaign that in my lifetime has only been equaled by the campaign of Robert Kennedy in 1968 for the amount of enthusiasm and excitement and the sense of a different type of politics that is possible for us in the society. It is hope that can help us as a society move from where we are now to the not yet of our future.
Thank you. Professor Washington?
So abrupt, Ken. Obama could just as easily have begun his speech with the Gettysburg Address. And in some ways, it might have been even more appropriate because one of the things that Lincoln points out in the Gettysburg Address in 1863, in the midst of Civil War, is that the nation was on a mission. And his beginning, 7 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal, was really about the Declaration of Independence. And the fact that in 1863, they still hadn't gotten there. And what he was encouraging the nation to do in 1863 was to continue what they had begun by the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, and with blood. And so when we think about the Gettysburg Address and you think about what Barack Obama is attempting to do, it is to help the nation, as a nation, live up to the true meaning of its creed. So it's even deeper as a mission if you think about the Gettysburg Address. And I think it's important I'm an Obama supporter, bar none, but I think it is important to see that this nation has many, many problems. And one individual cannot solve them all. And electing Obama as president is not going to solve them all. But I think it is an important renewal if something like that happened. And I think that the speech he gave represents principle, it represents integrity, it represents honesty, it represents boldness, and it represents taking a chance. because he identified with his black community, he identified with his Americanness, he identified with his white grandmother, he identified with his black Kenyan father, and he said, I am all of these things, and you have to accept me as being all of these things. So I think he provides a unique experience and a unique individual for us from which to choose as opposed to the other two. Having said that, I think it's important to understand some of the issues that will certainly arise if he were fortunate enough to be president, and if we were so fortunate. One has to do with Palestine and Israel, and the fact that, like all the other candidates, he's silent on that issue. And Palestine has a right to be just as much as Israel has a right to defend itself. And yet we have not heard anything about that. We've heard, indeed, a one-sided discussion about that. So it's important to see Barack Obama where he is, and at the same time to see him as what I consider to be, at this point in our history, our best hope.
Thank you very much. One very quick observation. Before we thank our panelists, the Cornell New Student Reading Project will, in fact, be reading Gary Wills's Lincoln at Gettysburg in the fall. So we will take up the debate that you've helped stimulate this afternoon. Please join me in thanking our wonderful panelists, including Professor Turner, who had to leave, and thank you for your attention.